In tonight's Fox in Focus, a California judge has struck down part of that state's Jessica's Law. It's the part that says sex offenders cannot live within 2,000 feet of a place where children congregate or gather. The judge says that that part of the law is unconstitutional, and critics of that law say some sex offenders are having such a difficult time finding a place to live that they become homeless, and that makes it harder for the state and law enforcement to keep track of them. So what does that mean for Texas, which has similar restrictions in our state's Jessica's Law? Joining us now is Attorney Stanley Schneider and Brent Hayes, an assistant DA in Montgomery County. And gentlemen, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you.
So will the judge, the ruling in California, will that have a ripple effect and perhaps affect the state law here in Texas?
It could happen depending on what restrictions the legislature places on sex offenders. Right now we have a 1,000-foot restriction. As long as people can find a place to live and work, then it will not have an effect. But if it does impact people's places to live, it causes increased problems for law enforcement, like the homeless, keeping track of the homeless. Forcing people to not live in homes where we can find them.
Brent, you find some fault with the judge's ruling in California?
Yes, there's much less chance that it's going to happen in Texas, at least by a Texas state judge, because our judges here don't have a history of judicial activism that the California judges do. California judges, state and federal, have given us decisions such as under God in the Pledge of Allegiance is unconstitutional, which went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. In this case, the judges made a policy decision. If people want to make those kinds of arguments, they need to go to the legislature. In California, they can go to the California legislature. In Texas, they can go to the Texas legislature. But unless a federal judge in Texas or the federal Fifth Circuit or the United States Supreme Court were to adopt what this judge in California said, it's not going to happen in Texas.
Well, what about the distance requirements themselves? Do you think they're valid?
We're allowed, as Stanley's website says, we're allowed in Texas and in other places to send sex offenders to prison for life. If we can send them to prison for life in some circumstances, it's just common sense that we can let them out of prison with the modest requirement that there are just some areas where they can't live.
But they're not modest requirements, right, Stanley?
Well, in California,
in some cases?
In California, they can't live in San Francisco, San Diego, or Los Angeles. That's not modest. In Texas, in Houston, we're lucky. It's a big city.
Yeah, but I know from covering many stories, for instance, that in the smaller surrounding bedroom communities of Houston, they have made these distance requirements, and that only pushes some sex offenders into other communities.
Right, away from those communities. And we have to have restrictions to protect the communities, but we have to be reasonable. 500 feet, 1,000 feet, that may be reasonable. That's what some of the statutes say. But once you start getting a quarter mile, a third of a mile, a half a mile.
They can't live anywhere and they have trouble finding work, right?
They can't live some places, can't get an apartment, can't find work. And the more restrictions we place on them, we're forcing them outside of the controls. Yeah. And what the rules are is control.
Brent, nobody's here to defend sex offenders because what they do, and oftentimes, are horrendous crimes. They wind up killing their victims. But there are some other sex offenders who don't commit such heinous crimes. Now, one of the things that we found in doing the predator check stories over a period of time is that sex offenders feel like they've paid their due to society and they have come out but they're registered, have to register where they live, whereas people who may have committed harsher crimes, murder even, don't have to do that.
Well, Jessica's Law was named after the little girl in Florida who was, of course, as carried by the national media, and most people will remember, was abducted and murdered
by a neighbor, a guy who lived close to her home.
Who lived close to her in a mobile home. Jessica's Law is aimed at protecting the most vulnerable people in our society, young children. There are different classes of sex offenders, there are different types of sex offenses, but Jessica's Law is aimed at protecting young children. And everything that Stanley said is an important consideration in determining how to deal with these people in terms of how far away they are required to live from a home or a school or a park or anywhere where children congregate. Yeah. But those are issues for the legislature. It's just common.
Well, let me get back to Stanley, though, because we're running out of time. But the judge in California says there's no evidence to show that just because sex offenders live close to where children are, that they're more likely to reoffend.
Well, that's what he says, but the important consideration is we want controls. We want to protect communities. And so if you don't have reasonable places where we know where people can live and we know where they are, how do you have controls? And if you're forcing the homeless and you're forcing to create a community of people who are living in hiding.
Okay.
That's not a decision for the judge. That's a decision for the legislature.
How about a solution for our viewers very quickly? What would be the best thing for Texas?
The best thing for Texans is to communicate with their state legislators and tell them their concerns and to look for effective and fair laws. Laws that are fair but also effective in dealing with these people, because they're recidivists, they're dangerous, and we have to protect our children.
And Stanley, from your point of view, what's the best solution?
Well, I think we agree. We have to be reasonable. And if it's a 500-foot or 1,000-foot, we can't go to extremes. 2,000 feet is too far, and if communities that go too far in restrictions cause problems for the state and for the defense and for our citizens.
All right. Well, it's a tough problem for our legislators to tackle, and we'll see what happens here in Texas.
It's the local legislatures.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.